Okay, so let's get started. It's good to see everybody. So we left off in towards the end of chapter 12, First Kings. Jeroboam is king, and I want to we actually left off at the end of verse 27, but I just want to reference once again in the first few verses of this section. In verse 25, we learn that Jeroboam built Shechem, which we said is actually more like fortifying Shechem, because Shechem is not a new city, it's a very old city. And he was there, and then he left there and he built up or fortified Penuel. And I think we referenced the fact that Penuel is a city that we knew from Jacob. When Jacob comes back from Laban, he wrestles with the angel, and then he names the place where he is Penuel. That talks about in Hebrew, it derives from the phrase seeing God. And as he struggled with the angel, it was an encounter with God. But what I neglected to mention was that the question, of course, is why did he leave Shechem? Shechem is a natural capital. It's an ancient capital. It was a place that was an important city for the Canaanites. We know even going back to Jacob's time, it was a very important city. It's a natural place for him to have his capital. Why would he have left? And we talked about the fact that he would have left because there was war, there was a threat. So what I neglected to mention is something, and I'm going to be referring a few times to a teacher of mine that I actually studied First Kings with, the whole book of Kings with. His name is Rabbi Samet. He lives here in Israel. And so he references, and I don't think he made this up. He himself found this or studied this somewhere. But there's a king named Shishak. Now, we met Shishak already. Shishak is the king of Egypt. And there's that period of time when Jeroboam goes down to Egypt and he finds refuge with Shishak. And now we learn, now in a few chapters hence, we will learn that Shishak actually goes up and fights against Judea. And we learn there that Rehoboam hands the treasures of the capital of Jerusalem to Shishak. At some point, not that long ago, archaeologists found a writing, an inscription that records Shishak's battles in the area, and is found in a place called the Bubastite Portal at Karnak. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Anyway, it lists many towns that were captured, and it seems he also captured Shechem. In other words, the Bible tells us that he came upon Judea, but it seems he also came upon Israel. And so a theory is that it was at that time that Jeroboam actually fled from Shechem because he was being attacked by Shishak. Of course, the big question is this the same guy that gave him refuge when he was fleeing from Rehoboam? Why is it that he had to flee from Shishak? Why would Shishak fight against him? And we don't really have a good answer to that. Just doesn't have that information. But that's an interesting theory, so I just thought I would put that before you. Then we learned in 26 and 27 that his very, very important, it's mentioned here, over and over again, that Jeroboam was very concerned if the people were to continue going up to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple and to bring sacrifices to the temple. He is worried that that will return them to be loyal to the kingdom of David, to the house of David, Rehoboam, who's ruling from Jerusalem. And we also, I think we mentioned the fact that he was given a promise. He was given a promise by the prophet, by Achiah Hashiloni from Shiloh. The promise was that God had given him these tribes that were going to be his. He was going to rule by virtue of God's decree. He was ruling over this vast area, the vast majority of the people of Israel, what becomes known as the Kingdom of Israel or the Northern Kingdom. He's going to rule about this, but the actual initial promise and what Achiah was telling him was that it was very important to him that he continued to obey God. The message being, we are going to have a political division, but both kingdoms need to be worshiping the same God. And that when you worship God, if you're following God's commandments and you're worshiping God, part of that is going to the temple. We know in Deuteronomy, we know that, God says very, very clearly, once I choose the place to place my name, and we know that that happens in King David's time when the Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is selected and Solomon builds the temple. Once that happens, there is no other worship sanctioned. If you're going to worship God with sacrifice, of course, you can pray wherever you are, whenever you want. But if you want to go through this actual worship, which is prescribed in the Bible, then you have to go to Jerusalem, and you go at certain times of year, and you bring certain types of sacrifices. And it's the tribe of Levi who has been assigned to be in charge of the worship. And from within the tribe of Levi is the priests, and they've been assigned, and the priests are the descendants of Aaron, and they have that job. Nobody else can have that job. So that is the original vision that God gives him. You will have your own political kingdom, but religiously, you are still bound to Jerusalem, not to the king of Jerusalem, but to the temple in Jerusalem. But despite that promise, Jeroboam finds that very threatening, and he's fearful, and he doesn't trust God's word. Okay, now, in a way, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. This doesn't turn him into an evil person. It turns him into someone who made a grave mistake. That's how it starts out. He has a lot of grave mistakes here that turn into a very problematic kingdom. Okay, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, because Jeroboam doesn't start out as an evil person. He starts out as someone that God has chosen for this role. So the truth of the matter, the idea of two different kingdoms with the same religion, unheard of in the ancient world. Absolutely unheard of. First of all, in the pagan world, each nation has its own god. And if you're going to move from Moab to Ammon, you're going to change gods. And it's also because a pagan worldview is that a particular god only has dominion over a certain area or a certain issue. Of course, is the god of rain, right? So the god of rain is not in charge of the sun. That's somebody else. But in the same way, the god of Ammon is not the god of Moab, and that's just how it is. So you can see now, Jeroboam is not pagan by any means, but you can see we're only a faith that would have worshipped one God as the God who is the God of the entire universe and the God of all living beings. Only that can sustain an idea of two different kingdoms with one God and one religion. So so basically, this whole concept would have infused the political ideology of the time. It wasn't just about, what do I believe in God and pagan versus God? He believed in the one God, but the political philosophy of the time was very much each nation has its own temple. So even though they believe in the same God, we need to worship him separately. You cannot have this idea of someone going from one nation into the other nation to go to the temple. Okay, so that's really where he's coming from. Did he sin? Of course he sinned, because he should have trusted God's word to him. But that was the beginning of the problem. Okay, now we're going to start with verse 28, where we get into a whole new kind of issues. And here we have a list from verse 28 to the end of the chapter. We have a list of a number of things that Jeroboam does wrong. And it creates a real slippery slope into what happens to this whole kingdom and the worship, the pagan worship, and all kinds of the problems that we will encounter from here to the end of the book. Okay, so verse 28. So the king took counsel. It's very interesting. It doesn't say who he took counsel with. And as soon as I saw that, I was saying, like, who do you, and it's interesting. I read somewhere that there's kind of like a contrast. If you recall, at the beginning of the chapter, we have Rehoboam taking counsel, trying to determine how he is going to respond to the demand of the people to lower the burden of taxes. And he takes counsel of two different groups, the older people and the younger people. The older people give him what would have been very wise counsel, come towards them, be kind, it's worthwhile, it's an investment. Whereas the younger people said, no, you got to be even worse than your father. And that, of course, is what gets him into trouble. So here we have Jeroboam about to make some very serious mistakes, and we have him taking counsel. So it could be that who he takes counsel with is not so important, but it's a question of, it's a similar pattern. These people get into trouble. If he should have been taking counsel, it should have been with the prophet, okay? It should have been, with someone pray to God for enlightenment. But he had a prophet. He could have so easily turned to the prophet and say, give me counsel. Instead, he just took counsel with whoever these people are. And they clearly gave him very bad advice, as the advisors that Rehoboam took counsel with. Okay, so what did they say and what did he do? He makes 2 golden calves. He said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Okay, so first of all, this statement, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Those of you who have very, very sensitive ears are probably hearing, realizing that this is a direct quote from the last time we met the golden calf. Remember, we had a golden calf. We had a golden calf back in Exodus. After the revelation at Sinai, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He spends 40 days and 40 nights there, receiving the law from God. And while he's up there, things start to happen down below. So if you'd like to look at Exodus 32, okay? Exodus 32, we have, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered against Aaron and said to him, come make us a god who shall go before us, for that man Moses who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. Okay? And then Aaron sent to take off the gold rings, blah, 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 and they make this golden calf. Now let's read verse 4. And they exclaimed, you see where that is in the middle of verse 4, and they exclaimed, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, 1 second. This is exact quote, and this time the translation got it right. It's the exact same words in Hebrew and in English in Exodus 32 as here in chapter 12, Kings. So it's very interesting. First of all, we have these golden calves, and you can ask yourself, what? The golden calves? I mean, we haven't seen that in a very long time. That was in the desert, in the wilderness, right after they came out of Egypt. They got punished. They learned their lesson. It's done. All right. Hundreds of years have passed since then. What's going on here? But the very fact that the Bible will tell us that it's the same exact words already tells us something's going on here that's very similar things here. Okay, so hold that question for a second. But it's clear also that in building the golden calves, he is following through on what we saw as his fear in the verses above. He's afraid they're going up to Jerusalem. Now, what do you mean going up to Jerusalem? Throughout, now in David's time, they didn't necessarily go up to Jerusalem. They didn't have a temple. But throughout Solomon's reign, they were going up to Jerusalem. And that's 40 years. Or a little less, because Solomon, didn't build the temple the first year, but pretty much at the beginning of his reign, he built the temple. So they've been going up, to Jerusalem, and he finds that how am I going to break this habit? And don't forget, these are very religious people. The whole nation is religious, and in fact, the entire biblical times, people are people of faith. It's very interesting. Sometimes they get messed up in what they're supposed to be putting their faith in. But these are people who want to have faith, okay? And the attraction throughout the biblical period of the pagan gods is because they're looking for either something they can relate to, something they can see, something they can feel, something that the other nations around them are praying to. But they want to pray today in our world, we are so accustomed to our major challenge today is not other religions, although there are problems like Islam. Okay. If Islam were peaceful, we wouldn't have problems with people praying to God in a different way, calling him a different name, whatever. The problem with Islam is, what they turn in, what practices and theologies. But we wouldn't be as challenged. They're like Christianity and Judaism. Okay. For centuries, Christians were persecuting Jews, but today, thank God, we're in an era of tolerance and friendship and finding common ground. We all believe in God. We have different ways of worshiping God. We have different elements of theology. That's not our challenge. Our challenge of all of us is atheism. Our challenge is, how do you even get someone to understand that there is a higher being, that there is a creator, that there is an entity you can pray to? That is our challenge today. That was not the challenge in ancient times. The idea of a higher being, of something to pray to, someone to pray to, that everybody understood. The question was, who are you praying to? Okay, what does that God tell you to do? All of those things. But the idea of praying or worshiping, that everybody agreed about. Okay, so here we have Jeroboam, and he has a problem with going to Jerusalem, but he doesn't have a problem. These are people who want to pray. They want to worship. So he can't just say, I'm going to build a wall here and I'm going to prevent you. I'm going to have guards there just south of Bethel, so you cannot go to Jerusalem. That's not enough, because he has to service, or he has to satisfy the need of his people to pray and to worship. And so the next step is he going to set up an alternative temple system, an alternative worship. Okay. Now, I want to put aside the golden calves for a second. I'm going to go back and discuss that at length, but just to see what he's doing here, he's putting up two places. We'll look at verse 29. He set up one in Bethel and placed the other in Dan. So he has two golden calves. He puts one in Bethel, one in Dan. What are those two places? The borders of the kingdom. Dan is up in the north. If any of you have been to Tel Dan, in the lovely spring, that park area, it's all the way in the northern Galilee on the border of the Golan Heights. That would have been the northern extremity of the kingdom. And Dan, and in fact, in Bible, very often the Bible talks about from Dan to Beersheba as the borders, north-south borders of Israel. So Dan is the furthest north. Bethel, that's the border between Israel and Judah. South of Bethel is where the kingdom of Judah begins. With the territory of Benjamin. Bethel is the cutoff point between Benjamin to the south and Ephraim to the north. So he's putting his temples at the two extremities. So you can, on the one hand, you could say, well, this makes sense. It makes it more convenient. Nobody has to travel so hard. So let's say take the middle of the kingdom. You travel south if you're closer to Bethel, and you travel north if you're closer to Dan. But there also is a concept here, perhaps, and this may be a somewhat pagan concept that he's borrowed at this point, that the physical location of your temple says something about your protection. Now, for those of us who believe in one God, we all believe in one God who we can't see, who doesn't have an image. We don't have any pagan, pagan remnants in us. Okay, we don't think that way. Okay. So we don't think in terms of God. If you put a God here or you put an altar here, you're going to be protected here, but you won't be protected there. God can protect us anywhere on earth. We can, and that's also very interesting. You can't run from God. It works two ways. Okay, God can protect you wherever you are, and you can't run from God. Don't think that if you go in the basement, you're going to be protected. So here, it's kind of a pagan concept that he's doing on the borders, because he's kind of saying, okay, God, this is this is where you need to give us protection between the two calves. Okay, this is our protection between the two temples. Okay. Now, next, verse 30. He says that proved to be a sin, okay? For the people went to worship the calf of Bethel and the one at Dan. Okay. It's kind of funny that we have to say, oh, and by the way, that was a sin, because people actually went to worship there. And what is the sin? And I think there's two sins going on here. Okay. One is they were actually worshiping perhaps a golden calf. Let's again put that aside. But the second sin is they were worshiping there instead of going to Jerusalem. That in and of itself is a problem. Okay. Now, I've referenced this, but I just want to read this verse to you, just so that if I can find it quickly, because I didn't note it. Here we go. I found it. So in Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. Okay. So in Deuteronomy 12, it starts by talking about destroying all the pagan sites. Okay. And then in verse 4, it says, and when it talks about destroying the pagan worship sites, it's talking about how they're spread out all over the country. Okay. And then it says, verse 4, do not worship the Lord your God in like manner. And verse 5, but look only to the site that the Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation to establish his name there. There you are to go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes, worship, etc., etc. Okay, here, what God is making very, very clear, once there is a temple, pagan worship is not just a problem because it's pagan. Pagan worship also has a different style of worship. They worship all over the place. Okay, they have altars in every town, and God here is making very clear: once there's a temple, once I have placed my name on a particular temple, on a particular site, okay, and we know that that's the Temple Mount with David when when that gets selected. Once that happens, you can't worship all over the place. So that is a separate problem. Let's assume that Jeroboam now was setting up altars in Dan and Bethel without any golden calves. He was setting up altars to worship God in those places. Okay? Even though he would be worshiping God, that in itself is still a sin because they're not worshiping in Jerusalem. And once Jerusalem was selected, you can only worship there. Okay. Now, verse 31, he also made cult places, or Beit Bamot. Interesting, it's called cult places. It's a bama is a high place. It's like an altar, wherever, some other places. Okay, but he made temples of these altars. Okay, that's really how I would more accurately translate that word. And appointed priests from the ranks of the people who are not of Levite descent. Okay, so here he not only has altars in different places, he builds temples in different places, not just Dan and Bethel. That's where he put the golden calves. But in all these other places, he also put additional temples, and he appointed Levites. They're not Levites. He appointed priests who are not Levites. So here we have another problem. According to God's word, a priest is only of the descendant of Aaron from the tribe of Levi. So, okay, another problem. Now, why we learned earlier why it is that he puts these golden calves and places them in Dan and Bethel. Scripture tells us itself he sees still as a way of combating the threat of the people going to worship in Jerusalem. What is the threat about the priests? And here it's very possible that the priests doesn't matter where they live, they will remain loyal to the temple. Their whole life, their whole raison d'etre, everything that they've trained and been brought up to do is around the temple. And what would happen is the Levites would live. There were Levite cities all over the country. And those Levite cities are listed, okay, both in Joshua and few of them are listed in the ones that are also cities of refuge are listed in Deuteronomy, but in Joshua, there's a whole list of cities that are Levite cities, and they're all over the country. Okay, so what would happen is the Levites lived where they lived. When they didn't have duty, they took turns They had a rotation. So when they were not on duty, on call in the temple, they were in those cities and they were usually teaching. Our tradition says they taught the Bible. They were responsible for the education of the people, and they didn't have land. That's why they were living in cities. So they were not involved agriculturally, but they were servicing the people. Okay. And so Jeroboam had Levites who were also living in the Levite cities in the north. So why didn't he just take them? Because they would have been still loyal to the temple. Okay. So that's also, all of this seems to be more political than religious. He is making compromises on religion, but it all seems to serve a political goal. Okay. He's stationed at Bethel, the priests of the shrines that he had appointed to sacrifice to the calves that he had made. We're assuming these are the priests. The priests that he appointed are those who are not from Levite, okay? And Jeroboam established a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month in imitation of the festival in Judah. He established one at Bethel and he ascended the altar there. Okay, so now this is another problem, what he did. He put a holiday in the 8th month, mimicking a similar holiday. Which holiday? The Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles takes place on the 15th day of the 7th month. And he instead made it the 15th day of the 8th month. Again, he is concerned. He is trying to compete with Jerusalem by creating different alternatives. Okay, so if he had a head-on competition, if he celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles at the temples all over the city, all over the country, including at Dan and at Beit El, and it was the same Feast of Tabernacles, it's a cheap imitation. If I want the real Feast of Tabernacles, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. Okay? So instead, he has, well, no, you don't need to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles because we have our own Israelite holiday, and we're celebrating it next month. So you may have still some people going to Jerusalem in the 7th month, but if the 8th month festival is seen to be the true local indigenous festival of the Northern Kingdom, he will be able to wean the people away from Jerusalem in that way. Now, one of the theories is, what does this mean, the 8th month? It's an interesting theory. It wasn't just that he said it next month, but that he did a leap year. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the leap year tradition in Israel, in Judaism, is that we get it from the verse in Exodus. You should preserve the month of Aviv, which is Aviv literally is a barley seed, and you should. Meaning that's taken to mean you have to always make sure that Passover is going to fall during that period in the springtime, during that period. Now, we have a lunar calendar. The lunar calendar is 11 days shorter than the solar calendar. If you don't have a leap year, you're going to be, and the Muslims, for example, do not have a leap year. They also have a lunar calendar, which means Ramadan travels around the year. Every year, Ramadan is 11 days earlier. Okay? So in Judaism, we don't have that because every 3 years or so, we add a month. And we add a month that puts it back forward. Okay? So when do we add a month? We usually add a month right before the first month. We add an additional last month. So instead of 12 months in the year, we have 13 months in the year, so that the first month, which is the month that we celebrate Passover, that first month will always take place in the spring. Okay? Now, by the way, I discovered that Easter, which is the holiday that is also not set by a calendar day, it's set based upon the spring solstice? No, spring equinox, whatever it's called. Equinox, right? Right. It has to do with always a time after the spring. The official spring is March 21st, and so it's dated around there. It's in a different system, creating the exact same idea. Passover and Easter both have to always end up in the spring. Okay, so what he did, this is the theory, what he did is he did a leap year, added a month, but instead of adding it before Passover, he added it before the Feast of Tabernacles. So that the 8th month was in his mind a 7th month. Okay, he just changed the calendar a little bit. Okay, but that's just an interesting thing. And he says here on the 15th day of the 8th month, the month in which he had contrived of his own mind to establish a festival for the Israelites, Jeroboam ascended the altar that he had made in Bethel. Okay, so that's another problem. He ascended the altar. Does a king ascend the altar? Never. The only people who are supposed to be sacrificing at the altar are the priests of Levite descent. So what we see here is quite a number of problems, okay? First of all, he builds these two golden calves. Before that, the first thing he does is he prevents the access to Jerusalem. And that is his overall goal, by the way, and everything else fits into that. He puts up two golden calves and builds temples around them. He creates other temples with altars in them, different parts of the country. He appoints priests to service all these different altars who are not from the tribe of Levite, and he creates a new holiday or defers the holiday by a month, and he puts that in the 8th month. Okay, so this is all the problems that we have discovered that he did. Now we've come to the end of our time. So next week when we meet, we're going to try to understand a little bit more about what he exactly has in mind. And we have to start with the golden calf. And what I'm going to present to you next week is a very different way of looking at these issues of the golden calf than what we may be accustomed to. Okay, but that will take up next week. Any questions or comments? Someone is, yeah. Yes, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I was thinking, Sondra,
Yes.
that's pretty much what the early Christian church did, the Orthodox Church. They set up a different place called Rome. They made anybody that wanted to be a priest. And oh, yeah, we changed the holidays. Well, throw in an Easter and a Christmas here. So, they were kind of copying Rehoboam.
Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. Sorry.
You're right. You know what? And it's, if you think about it, it's replacement theology.
Exactly.
Classic. Yeah. And it's very interesting because early Christianity, and it's very interesting that you say this because I think it's very, very interesting. If Christianity had come from having nothing to do with Judaism, it came out of nowhere with its own ideas, or it grew out of Zoroastrianism or Buddhism. I don't know. If it came out of something else, or if it just was totally different, it had nothing to do with any other religion, you don't have the same need to create replacements because you're different. When you are growing out of a religion that has its own very strongly rooted traditions, rules, theologies. So on the one hand, you're coming out of that, but you want to separate yourself from that. You want to say, no, we're not the same. We're different. Then you have these issues where you have to draw from the same root, but change them. And that brings you the people. And as if you want to take the people that are used to doing, and by the way, there is a theory, which not everybody agrees with, but is a theory that was put forward by Maimonides back 12th century, I believe, 12th to 13th century. Anyway, he comes forward with this whole thing about sacrifices. What are sacrifices? Why do we have sacrifices? And for a person living at that time, sacrifices were not very meaningful. For us, sacrifices are not meaningful. We have a hard time seeing how I go and I take a sheep and I slaughter him and I put him on an altar and I spill the blood and throw the blood on the horns of the altar. How does that make me feel closer to God? Okay, we understand, we've learned it, we see the point, but it's not something that's natural to us, not something we relate to. And what Maimonides says is the reason God put the sacrifices was because at that time, sacrifice was the main way of worship for whatever God you worshiped. It didn't matter who you worshiped. If you worshiped a God, you worshiped through sacrifice. And therefore, to take people of Israel out of Egypt and create something new and say, okay, you're my people. You worship God. You're not worshiping all those other gods that you saw in Egypt or all these other gods that you see around you, that it would be much easier for them to relate. You change everything. You change the theology. You change who you believe in. You change who God is, everything. But at least give them an ability to worship with a tool that they are familiar with. Okay. And we can talk about that even today. Today we pray. What would happen if someone said to you, Christianity, no, don't pray. It's not a good thing to pray. You can be a good Christian, you can't pray. You would say, what do you mean I can't pray? This is how I talk to God. Don't take away prayer. Okay. And it would have been that same kind of thing for an ancient Israelite. Okay. So that's a good thing. Okay. That's God was coming towards us and understanding us. And of course, the big question that remains is what happens with the third temple? Are we going to go back to sacrifices or not? And that remains a big question. There's all kinds of discussions about it. Messiah comes, he'll let us know. But, when we're talking about this, it's a very similar thing. If Jeroboam is making changes, if he's going to make two radical changes, he alienates the people because they're going to say, what the heck? Okay. If he says, I'm not doing the Feast of Tabernacles at all, forget it. No more, done. They're going to miss it. But he does the Feast of Tabernacles, but he does it a little differently. And he puts it in a different month, and they go to Dan or they go to Bethel to worship instead of to Jerusalem, but they still have their booths and they walk around with their lulavs. Okay, we can relate. And I think it's just a very important human psychology. So that was great, Jim. I like that.
Can we just finish with Abraham and Shechem? You talked a lot today about Shechem. And if you go back to Genesis, it seems to be that this is the first place that Abraham stopped at on his way south from Haran.
Yes, Genesis 12.
Yeah, exactly. And it's here that God appears to him and makes his promise to him, this first is it the first promise? And
yes.
And seals it with he builds an altar and seals it with a sacrifice. So Shechem is a very, very important place. From the very beginning.
So one of the things also we're going to be discussing in this vein that we were discussing now, and we'll take it up next week, Shechem, he doesn't set up as a religious place at all. It's a political capital, and then he leaves it. Okay. But Bethel and Dan, okay, these are places, and other things that he takes up here, we will find elements of the same replacement idea. He's not making up places that have no history. He's taking places that have a history and he is co-opting them into his new political religion, shall we say, or something like that. So that's what we're going to take up next week as well. Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Well, good to see you all again. See you all next week. Please God. Bye-bye.
Bye.